Hello, welcome to the first of the two audio presentations on the lectures on the U.S. Congress. U.S. Congress is the lawmaking branch of the U.S. government. It's one of the three main branches of the U.S. government, along with judicial branch, which interprets laws, executive branch, which execute laws, the legislative branch, which is the U.S. Congress, makes laws. So it's the lawmaking branch of the U.S. government. Some other terms that you can hear about the U.S. Congress is the legislators, legislature, lawmakers, policymakers, etc. In Europe, the common terminology is the word parliament. The parliament or the Congress is an outcome of the representative democracy we have in our societies. As you would remember from earlier courses, representative democracy refers to that type of political system in which ordinary citizens elect representatives to represent their opinions when it comes to lawmaking. So instead of voting for matters that impact their societies directly, as they used to do back in ancient Greece, they instead elect representatives or lawmakers who create laws for the society on their behalf. In the U.S., the lawmaking authority is housed at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It's this white structure that is an architectural marvel. It's a very pretty building, so anyone is ever in Washington, D.C., I suggest you check out this building. It is really quite an enjoyable trip. The U.S. Congress has a bicameral structure, which is another way of saying there are two houses in it, or two chambers. The lower house or chamber is the House of Representatives, and the upper house is the Senate. And for a law proposal to be adopted as a law, it needs to be approved by both of these houses, and then the president needs to approve it as the final third authority on the matter. Those systems that have only one house legislatures are called unicameral structures. Many countries in Europe have unicameral parliaments, whereas in the U.S. we have a bicameral Congress. Why do we have a bicameral system while most of most of other advanced democracies have unicameral systems is a good question to ask. And the numbers are threefold. The reasons are threefold. First and foremost, founding fathers thought that if they had a second institution in the Congress, in the lawmaking authority, then it could be a good idea or a good way of double checking to make sure that the will of the people does indeed serve to the best interests of the people. So if you consider the historical context in which they created this institution, this unique institution, it would make more sense for you. At the time of the founding of the United States back in the mid 1700s, the average level of literacy and education and accordingly political consciousness were quite low. So as a result, the founding fathers, on one side, they wanted to create a democracy and give people the power to rule, but on the other side, they didn't want to give too much power to the ordinary people. So as a result, they created the two-house structure, and the House of Representatives, the lower chamber, consisted of the representatives who represent the people, the will of the people elect them. And then they created the Senate as a second institution, an upper chamber, if you will, that makes sure that what passes the House to become a law is indeed to the best interests of the society. If you will, you can call that an elitist approach, but it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was an it was an unjustifiable cause or motivation on their end. A second reason why they created the Senate was the fact that they wanted to give more power in the national government to those states that have smaller populations. The number of representatives each state would have in the U.S. Congress is determined by the population of each state. But they created the Senate and they decided that 2 senators should be given to each state regardless of the population of that state. Meant that those states that had smaller populations would have a larger impact on the national government than the larger states. And this was one of the motivations the founding fathers were argued to have. And thirdly, having a two-chamber lawmaking authority would mean that each chamber going to one party, being dominated by one party, could be a healthy checks and balance inside the lawmaking branch. So if you had a unicameral structure, it's only one house, which means that one of the 2 main parties, at least it's 2 parties in our system. In Europe, they have more parties that dominate the system, but one of the 2 main parties in our political duopolistic system would dominate the Congress, and the lawmaking would be an outcome of their priorities and preferences. Whereas having a 2-chambered house Congress would mean that each chamber could go to a different party, which can perform a form of checks and balance in-house, which disallows one single party's dominance over policy making, which is a welcome outcome. So when we look at the differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate, we see that the House is a larger body. There are 435 members in the House, whereas there are only 100 senators, 2 for each of the 50 states. Excuse me. The representatives are elected for 2-year terms, and the entire House comes up for re-election every 2 years. On the other side, senators are elected for 6-year terms, and only a third of the Senate comes up for re-election every 2 years. House of Representatives, the representatives in the House typically represent much smaller constituencies, which means voter districts, whereas senators represent much larger constituencies simply because there are only 2 people that are who are covering the entire state. Qualifications to become a representative is that you have to be at least 25 years old, a U.S. citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the states from which you're running. Whereas to become a senator, you have to be 30 years old at least, and a U.S. citizen for 9 years, and a resident of the state where you're. As a result of these differences, the House typically has a lower prestige than the Senate. And as a result, it has a lower visibility in the news media, and the rules that restrict their behaviors are more, and there are more rules for them and more restrictions on their behaviors in the House than the Senate. And most of their work is done in committees rather than on the floor of the House, whereas in the Senate it's split more equally between the committees and the floor. And the responsibilities given to these houses are the House of Representatives initiate revenues bills and impeachment of government officials, whereas the Senate approves or rejects these impeachment proceedings, and international treaties and presidential appointments to various places such as the Supreme Court or the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S.'s central bank. And Senate is the authority that decides which government officials should be removed from office and be convicted. There are a number of key positions in the Congress. Speaker of the House is one of those. he or she is considered to be the presiding officer of the House of Representatives. He or she is elected by the House on the first day of each congressional term, and this position is considered to be the third person in presidential line of succession, and which means that if something happens to the president and the vice president takes over and he becomes incapable of running the government, then the Speaker of the House takes over. One primary duty of the Speaker is to influence House's agenda. So what will the representatives discuss? Which particular bills will be discussed on the floor, is the business of the Speaker. He or she decides on that unilaterally. And also, he or she administers voting sessions on a daily basis. So every time representatives cast their ballot for various law proposals, then the Speaker administers all aspects of these voting sessions. Currently, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives is this lady in the picture, Nancy Pelosi of the Democratic Party, and she took over the position from Paul Ryan of the Republican Party, who is pictured on the right-hand side. Majority and minority leaders are also two other positions, key positions, and these are simply the leading members of the majority and minority parties in the Congress. And the whips are also another crucial position. Both parties would have whips, and their job is to make sure that the members of their parties would attend all voting sessions and they vote according to the party line, a concept called log rolling in political science. Just like rolling a log, all members of the party are expected to go along with the party's line when this happens, this type of approach happens. And the term whips comes from whipper-ins, which is a medieval England concept where a person during the hunts, you can consider them as hunting assistants, would whip dogs to make sure that they remain with the hunting group, and that the dogs wouldn't hunt the wrong animal. So there's a humorous background to this term. So how should a lawmaker vote? There are two approaches to it. A lawmaker can vote according to his or her own will, without necessarily considering what his or her constituents would want him to vote in a particular matter. This capacity is called the delegate capacity. On the other side, a lawmaker can also vote as a trustee, which means that he does not have to consider the preferences of his constituents. So the delegate authority, when a lawmaker considers what his voters would want him to vote as, is a more democratic approach, but it also requires a more politically active citizenry. The voters have to be following what's going on, be very knowledgeable with that particular voting issue, and have a very clear and very clearly documentable position on that particular issue, which may be difficult in real life because public opinion polls is the best best tools we can use to find out what voters want, but even they have a very small scope because in a country with 330 million people, it's quite difficult to really find out the common position of voters with public opinion polls. On the other side, trustee approach is more practical, but it comes with the principal agent problem, which means that the representatives may not represent the will of the people that they're supposed to represent. This wraps up the first of the two videos recordings on the Congress lectures. We will continue with the remaining slides in the next recording.